Today I'm going to be attempting Final Fantasy without healing outside of resting. This means no cure or heal magic and no using heal potions. The only recovery I can do is reviving at the clinic and resting at an inn or by camping. Not the most interesting challenge, but attempting Shining Force 2 without healing got me wanting to try other games. Although unlike the Shining Force variant, in this challenge I am allowed to grind at any point, meaning it probably won't be too tough, but I am curious to see at about what level I will be able to succeed. For this run, I'll be using Fighter, Thief, Red Mage, Black Mage, a team with decent toughness and magic versatility, while also having the Thief for emergency fleeing if needed. And for the record, I am using a bug fix patch. Things like spells, weapons, and the luck stat are properly functional. First job is to gear up and grind up to level 3. Usually I only go to 2 or even face Garland right away. But since I can't heal at all, I wanted to have a bit of extra wiggle room in case I encounter some rough battles along the way to the Temple of Fiends. By level 3, my spellbooks were adequately filled for the challenge ahead. I bought a couple pure potions and a tent, then set out to the Temple of Fiends. The trip there was easy, but Gotti almost didn't survive collecting the dungeon's 2 chests. Coming upon Garland, I swapped my formation a bit, and cast Fog to bolster Azure's defenses on the first round. From there, it was as easy of a fight as to be expected. Princess Sarah was saved, and I pressed onward to Provoca. I got the ship, then started preparing for the Marsh Cave. Because I hate deliberately exploiting bugs, as I consider it cheating to play games in a manner that goes against the designer's intent, I spent most of my time on the lake hunting for Kaizokus, rather than exploiting the Peninsula of Power. This went on until my party was level 6, both of my mages knew fire too, and I had a decent number of pures. It was a bit bold to attempt the Marsh Cave already, but I didn't want to steamroll this challenge with excessive grinding. I know that I could use my Thief to avoid encounters, but that would be boring. Not to mention that it would feel like a cop-out if I were to simply bypass most of the challenge by avoiding battles. The Thief is for emergencies, avoiding battles that just aren't worth fighting, and his late-game black magic. He's not here so that I can overcome this challenge like a cowardly bitch. I didn't plan on making my way through the entire Marsh Cave yet anyway. I just came to grab the chests on the upper level before departing to recuperate, as I normally do. The trip couldn't have gone much better. After resting with a tent, I entered the dungeon at full HP, missing only 1 magic point from casting Sleep on a pack of wolves. Inside, things were going surprisingly smoothly until Gotti suddenly got decimated by a trio of gargoyles. Because this was such a short dip into a small dungeon, I decided to reset and try again, something that I wouldn't be doing very often throughout this entire run. The second attempt went much better. Not a total breeze, but neither did I require a tent to recuperate for the trip back to Elfland. My second trip to the Marsh Cave, I delved into the basement, knowing that without the ability to heal, I couldn't be as reserved as usual with casting spells. Before long, the bottom level had dropped Gotti to critical health, and I had consumed all of my pure potions. Refusing to walk away empty-handed, I looted the northernmost rooms, then made a break for it. Narrowly escaping the cave, I returned to town to prepare for my next attempt. Gotti could now cast level 4 magic, so I farmed some gold to get him Ice 2, which included stopping by the dwarf cave to grab some extra cash. My third visit aimed to collect the remaining chests, including the crown. It goes without saying that the wizards were tough. A tempered Gurv carried us to victory, although not before Azure was felled despite double protection from Gotti's fog casts. But at least I was successful in retrieving the crown. Escaping the cave was a challenge all its own. Every fight was rapidly depleting my resources, and I was nearly stun-locked by a group of bones and crawls. Then, right at the exit, an undead horde leapt from the shadows. Luckily, Gotti swiftly incinerated them, clearing us a path to the exit. Azure was now a level behind, but at least I was making steady progress. Between Rub missing Gurv and Gaudy being the target of Slow 2, Astos was a total pushover. Got the crystal, got the herb, got the key, used the key to access locked treasuries, blew up the canal, onward to Melmond. This is where I expected the game to get more difficult. Conventionally speaking, the Earth Cave isn't as drastic of a difficulty spike as the Marsh Cave, but that doesn't mean the monsters aren't stronger. More importantly was the dungeon's greater length, making it all the more difficult to endure without healing. At this point, you're expected to be able to afford plenty of heal potions, and the dungeons are designed around that expectation. My original plan was to attempt the first 2 floors before returning to town, perhaps stepping outside real quick to use a cabin or house after the first to ready myself for the second. However, things did not go as planned when my team was overwhelmed by the earth elementals. When Gati had fallen, I knew that I needed to wrap things up, then make my way back to town sooner than expected, having to sail all the way back to Corneria while I was at it, since Melmond doesn't have a revival clinic. With the ground level cleared, I headed straight to the second floor. Before getting anywhere though, Gaudy was pummeled by a pair of trolls, forcing me into an early retreat. Thinking on the way back to Melmond, how the most annoying thing about this town is its lack of an item shop. I don't mind the lack of a clinic. Not only is the life spell sold here, but the clinic's destruction is incorporated into the story. But I've always hated how there's no item shop, meaning that every time I need to restock on tents, cabins, and pures, I need to sail all the way to another town, which is a lot more tedious than it is immersive. The next run went a lot better. There were still some tough fights, but tactical use of spells was able to overcome them. Earth elementals were still a problem when going for treasures, but there was little I could do about that other than power up Gurv with faster temper, then hope they would fall before I took too much damage. Despite Gaudy's critical condition, I decided to quickly peek into the 3rd floor. I grabbed one chest, Gaudy was brought to his knees in a subsequent battle, and I ascended from the Earth Cave. If I had an encyclopedic knowledge of this game, I would know which chests are worth grabbing and those I can just ignore, but even if I did have that knowledge, I'd probably be grabbing them anyway as an excuse to be making some semblance of consistent progress while getting level ups and money that I'll be needing along the way. Many large groups blocked our escape, but all were manageable. Gargoyles aren't too bad when slowed, and Gati could back up Gaudy's slow spell by casting Sleep, debilitating the gargoyles in the meantime, should Gaudy's turn come up later in the round. A pack of wolves was tamed with Confuse, and a pit of asps was frozen solid by a powerful blizzard. With that, I made it back to the surface. With money to spare after buying Gaudy's level 5 spells, I took a detour to Crescent to purchase bucklers for Gati and Azure, and some silver gear for Gurv. By the time I returned to Melmond, Gurv was level 15 and everyone else was tailing by only a few hundred points. Wanting whatever additional magic points that next level up may provide, not to mention that it would elevate Gaudia into the threshold of hitting twice with his weapon, I spent some time getting everyone up to level 13 before yet again returning to the Earth Cave. This time, my target was the vampire, debilitating ogres with Sleep and Dark, gargoyles with Sleep and Slow, and decimating hordes of smaller monsters with spells like Fire and Ice. I fought my way through the Earth Cave yet again. There was a somewhat rough encounter with some images, and an Earth Elemental shaved off a ton of Gurv's and Azure's hit points, but overall this dive went quite well. The vampire himself clobbered Gurv, but Gaudy swiftly retaliated with a lethal dose of Fire 3. I grabbed the ruby, then made my escape. Even though my hit points were dropping relatively low by the end, a condition that didn't fill me with confidence for reaching Lich, I wasn't feeling immediately imperiled. Using the ruby, I received the rod from Sarda, granting me access to the deepest chambers of the Earth Cave. Now that Gurv could hit 3 times, he could dependably slay weak monsters in a single strike. I was also finally getting some use out of the mute spell thanks to the wizard ogres. Alas, success can be a fickle thing in this game. Sometimes it just boils down to luck with how battles play out, or even the nature of those encounters. a truth made all too clear when Gotti received massive damage in what should have been a simple battle against 3 mummies. Later on, the party was also roughed up by a surprise attack of giants and werewolves, although Confuse helped out a lot in that encounter. By the time I had collected every treasure chest on the 4th floor, it was time to head back yet again. Gurv was still in good shape, but everyone else needed rest. Besides, I was running low on softs, and a critical hit on Gurv reaffirmed that leaving now was probably for the best. I doubted my remaining strength was sufficient for taking on Lich quite yet. As I neared the exit, I knew I was in the clear, short of a stun lock. Azure and Gotti were nearing defeat, but Gurv had plenty of strength to carry us the rest of the way if need be. I made one more quick stop at Crescent to pick up a silver axe. Gurv was only 1 level from being able to hit thrice with that, so I wanted it handy in case I gained that level on my way to Lich. Hoping this would be my last trip to the Earth Cave, I made a beeline for Lich. Gotti took some early hits. The damage itself wasn't severe, but he didn't have a whole lot of hit points to spare in the first place. I fought through an abnormal amount of undead, but had plenty of fire spells to burn them to ash. Gotti's HP also started getting kind of low, so I swapped him with Azure. When the time came, I needed him in good health for casting a couple magic barriers. As I reached Lich's chamber, Gurv hadn't quite gained that level, but oh well. I didn't want to risk the damage I might receive trying to grind it out real quick, so I approached the orb and released the Earth Fiend so that he may be slain. I opened by casting Anti-Lightning. That was the wrong call. At least Gotti sped up Gurv with fast before that happened, although I would have appreciated a temper cast as well. Next round, I cast Anti-Ice, then just started wailing on him with swords and magic. He didn't cast any other dangerous spells throughout the fight, so went down easily. That's 1 orb restored, 3 more to go. It was time to once again head to Crescent, this time being our actual destination for progress. I grabbed the canoe and set a course for the ice cavern. Along the way, Gotti got completely destroyed by a pair of hydras. I moved him behind Azure for protection, but the monsters still wanted to beat the crap out of him. Fortunately, I brought along a couple extra cabins, so I was able to fully restore my hit points after using a house to replenish the magic points spent along the way. Brimming with instant death, paralysis, and devastating attack spells, the ice cavern is always a miserable experience. The kind of dungeon that doesn't care how prepared you are. If the game fancies you dead, there's nothing you can do about it. Sleep and ice too were used when fighting cockatrices, substituting ice with fire when they were accompanied by several undead. But most battles were won by blasting monsters with fire magic, a responsibility shared between Gotti and Gotti, depending on the circumstances of any given battle and my MP reserves. Well, except for sorcerers. I ran for the hills whenever I saw them. When I acquired the flame sword, I gave it to Gotti instead of Gurv, feeling like he could benefit a bit more from the increase in strength. The short of it is that I died. A lot. But I knew I could pull it off. Especially after my first game over of this entire run made me realize that I should wait to grab the ice armor until after I've learned to exit or warp. That disaster aside, I was confident it could be done. I just needed the encounters to play in my favor or hope to dispatch threats before unleashing their deadly spells. So I just kept throwing myself into the lion's den until I came out with the floater. Which, sure enough, happened on my very first visit, in which I wasn't harassed by any mages or frost wolves, and the only dragon I encountered fell swiftly to a first strike. Next on the agenda was the Castle of Ordeals, which, if you know where to go, really isn't much of an ordeal. Sure, I died a few times, but that was only when dealing with monsters who can show up in massive hordes and incinerate your party before you even have a chance to defend yourself. Soon as that didn't happen, I got through with relative ease, acquiring the Rat's Tail and our job promotions from Bahamut. After which I returned the Silver Axe, which had been briefly replaced by the Flame Sword, to Gurv, now that Azure could equip the Flame Sword. Even with the weakest of my available weapons, Gurv still boasted my highest attack power. I decided that this was the best way to spread my party's proficiency, rather than putting all of my best eggs in the same basket. Normally, after purchasing new spells and gear for my fancy new jobs, Gurgu Volcano would be the next destination. That is where you're supposed to go before the Ice Cavern, but there are certainly benefits to doing them in the opposite order. But here's the thing. That dungeon is brimming with lava tiles that damage you with every step. Needless to say, surviving that mess without healing would be a nightmare. So I'll be holding off on that for now, instead heading to the Northern Hemisphere to better prepare myself for that inevitability. I started by freeing the ferry, then headed to the Waterfall Cave for some easy money, experience, and upgrades. I gave the defense sword to Azure and the flame to Gurv. That way, if need be, both frontline fighters could protect themselves with ruse magic. I was even able to walk back out instead of warping for more experience points. I got the Oxy Ale, then on the brink of leveling up, I did a touch of grinding before diving into the sunken shrine to visit the mermaids. The Zeus Gauntlet and Wizard Rod made quick work of some of these battles, but I admittedly underestimated how hard some of these monsters can hit. I'll have to be careful to not underestimate these later dungeons in general, based on how easy they usually are because of the overpowered nature of the heal staff and helmet. After grabbing every chest along the way and in the mermaid village, I walked back out of the shrine. Even though that round trip roughed the party up a fair bit, I figured that I might as well clear the sunken shrine in its entirety while I was there. I rested up at the inn, then dove back into the sea. One problem I immediately faced was that I don't know this dungeon's layout as well as many of the others, meaning lots of extra wandering in search of chests or taking roundabout routes to reach them. On only the second floor, Gadi suffered a critical hit that brought his HP dangerously low. I didn't want to bail without at least completing this floor's treasure hunt, so I fought through the pain, knowing that if Gadi fell at any point, Gati could always cast Exit to escape. On the plus side, knowing that I wouldn't be going any deeper meant that I could fight without MP conservation. Second attempt, my mages took heavy damage from what should have been an easy fight against a few lobsters before reaching the third floor. I zapped through many battles with the Zeus Gauntlet and Lightning 2 magic, but the damage kept mounting. Soon enough, Gadi was again on his knees, but like before, I had Exit as an emergency out, so I kept going, freezing water elementals and incinerating the undead, all the while collecting money and upgrades. Gati's health also started getting uncomfortably low, but if he fell, then I've always got Azure to flee us to safety. I handed the second light axe to Azure to help exorcise undead hordes if necessary. When Gadi ran out of level 3 magic points, he swapped to using the Wizard Rod's Confuse magic while Azure picked up the Lightning Slack with his own spells. It was a good effort, but eventually Gadi did fall. After grabbing the remaining chests in the immediate vicinity, I once again cast Exit to leave. Next visit, same strategy. Lots of lightning, changing things up a bit as MP demanded. Lobsters kept poisoning us, but I brought plenty of pure potions. By the time I was caught back up to my previous checkpoint, the party was naturally in better shape for having taken fewer detours, although Azure wasn't looking too hot. I had reached the final floor and was checking around for chests when Gadi suffered a catastrophic critical hit of 175 damage. Everything else was going so well too, that I wanted this to be the run. Azure kept keeping the party safe with sleep magic on top of Gadi's Wizard Rod, but Azure acted a bit too slowly during one battle, costing Gadi dearly. Not wanting to confront Kraken with an incomplete party, I fled again. Next attempt started poorly for Gadi, but what else is new? If I felt that my foes might survive an initial round of lightning blasts from Gati and Gadi, I sometimes had Azure provide sleep support. Gadi was again at low health, but we finally reached Kraken. Because of Azure's injuries, I had him and Gurv swap weapons for this fight, then shattered the Fiend's ball. I opened with 2 fast spells and a Fog 2. Second round, a second Fog 2 coupled with Temper and Saber. All the while, Gurv slashed away with his sword. Third round, the battle was brought to an easy victory, every one of Kraken's attacks having been utterly inconsequential. I ran some errands, then the Mirage Tower came next. I wouldn't be attempting the floating castle yet, but Mirage Tower is short and has some upgrades to grab before attempting Gurgu Volcano. Gurv got his ass kicked on the desert trek to the tower, so couldn't even fully heal by resting in a house. Because the tower wouldn't be followed by the castle, I was free to cast my strongest spells with little reservation, making quick work of any encounters that may have otherwise posed any sort of threat. I grabbed all of the chests, then walked out. Azure tripped into a crack on the way back to the airship. I began Gurgu Volcano by gathering treasure chests. None of the rewards would be useful, but I still wanted whatever experience points I might gain by walking from one to the next. At my levels, none of these monsters posed any kind of threat on their own, but that wasn't the problem. Even the weakest monsters can whittle down HP over time, especially since some of the most dangerous creatures within this inferno cast AoE spells. Not to mention that Gaudi still took considerable physical damage from some of these monsters due to the Black Wizard's low defense cap. It was those elements combined with the lava tiles that made this dungeon formidable even now. Oh, and there was also the Paralisks. After that happened, I fled using exit. Fortunately, I'd grabbed every chest on the second floor beforehand. I could get straight to making progress upon returning. Having fought only a few battles, HP levels were already suffering by the time I reached the next bundle of chests. The triviality of the battles themselves didn't matter. This dungeon's unavoidable toll was the reason why I held off on it until now. And even at these high of levels, I still wasn't too thrilled with the results. I really needed the battles to play out in my favor, or at least for most enemy attacks to focus on Gurv. On the plus side, I was strong enough that some monsters ran away. Gaudi eventually fell to 1 HP, and Gati wasn't looking too good either. But some first strikes kept the run going until the final floor. There still remained the fire dragon to slay before Kari, even though I would just be selling the guarded flame armor. Thankfully, many of the monsters in this dungeon are susceptible to stun, making quick work of what is normally a formidable adversary. I exited to rest one last time. The final visit to the volcano was a beeline to Kari, and because the entire party had fire resistance, the fight was utterly effortless. Only one orb remained. Next stop, the floating fortress. Just as soon as this bimbo gets the hell out of my way. Despite the dungeon's straightforward design, Gurv suffered a lot of damage scaling the Mirage Tower. Once in the floating castle, things didn't get quite as difficult as I expected. I occasionally threw out status spells, but most battles were swiftly won with brute force, receiving little damage in return. Status effects were mostly used for the sake of crowd or damage control without wasting my high-level magic points in battles where they weren't needed, or for dealing with monsters that possessed specific characteristics that were best handled by special methods. I found a heal helm that I swapped in for Azure's silver. I'm not allowed to use the helmet's magic, but both pieces of gear boast the same stats, and the heal helm simply gives off more of an endgame aesthetic. Although when I later found a protector ring, I dropped it in favor of sticking with the Zeus and Power gauntlets, having forgotten that the ring is superior to Gurv's Opal gauntlet until later on. Continuing to delve deeper, I wasn't feeling particularly threatened. The green Medusas were a bit annoying with their petrification and paralysis effects, but even they weren't actually dangerous. I grabbed the black shirt, which has one lower evasion point than the gold bracelet, but I'll gladly accept that in exchange for unlimited Ice 2 casts. Between that and the Wizard Rod, Gaudi could now save all of his level 4 magic points for casting fast. As for the white shirt, even though I would ultimately get no use out of it, I didn't want to drop it right away in case its magic would prove useful, so I instead discarded Gati's buckler to grab the third ribbon, which I set aside for now, yet unsure if I wanted to use that or the heal helm on Azure. I would later settle on the ribbon. But for now, I pressed onward to the last floor with treasure chests. Battles were still going smoothly and HP was impressively high. Until this happened! Nah, just kidding. I nuked their asses before they got the chance to cast their magic, but the sight of this spell did initially put me on edge. although more of them did show up, which didn't go nearly as well. That fight was won by a narrow margin, even with all of my fire-resistant equipment. I tried to mute the cats, which helped a little bit when the spell actually worked, but overall it was just a matter of killing them before they killed me. Azure almost fell because of getting clobbered earlier by a sentry, but held on by a thread. Luckily, by this point, I had just finished grabbing all of the remaining treasure chests in this dungeon, so I immediately exited without regret. I rested up, grabbed Excalibur, then returned once more, hoping this time to face Tiamat and restore the fourth and final orb. Without detours, the Mirage Tower and Floating Castle are very short, easy dungeons. Gotti took a hard hit from a vampire wizard, but that aside, I tore through everything in my way. Upon stepping into the final corridor, I prayed to not encounter Warmech as I marched to confront the fourth and final fiend, Tiamat. The battle opened similarly to Kraken, although Tiamat immediately proved herself more formidable with a powerful lightning breath. Fortunately, we already resist that thanks to our gear. I did have Gotti protect us with an anti-rub spell, although I'm not exactly sure if that spell is useful in this fight at all. Next round, Fog 2 bolstered our defenses, Saber and Temper increased our offense, and Tiamat spewed poisonous gas. Damage was quickly mounting, but the battle was finished with Gurv and Azure on offense, while Gotti supported them with a nuke spell, restoring the final orb! Next was the final dungeon, and the ultimate challenge. Going into this, I had no doubts about reaching this point. I didn't expect to be only a couple levels higher than normal, but that just demonstrates how much of a difference is made by making more trips to and from the dungeons instead of pushing yourself to get them done in fewer. But the Temple of the Past would unlikely be so simple. It's a massive marathon with tons of monsters and 5 bosses. Sure, many of the monsters are pushovers in their own right, but the challenge comes from their sheer numbers. Like wrestling against the lava tiles back at Gurgu Volcano, even the weakest of monsters can slowly whittle you down when there's enough of them. Normally, all of that is trivialized by the heal staff, making this dungeon more a test of patience than an actual challenge. But I don't have that luxury. And yes, I could just run away from the battles to focus only on surviving the bosses, and I did originally consider that. It's actually one of the reasons I chose a thief in the first place. But the more I played, the more I decided that would go against the spirit of this run, which is to overcome, not circumvent. So unless I was somehow still unable to do this by the time I hit level 50, I would stick to my guns, only running in the event of an emergency or when dealing with monsters that just aren't worth the risk. My immediate concerns were gas dragons and lich. Gas dragons not only bite hard, they can emit a toxic plume that deals heavy damage to the party. Not to mention all of the mounting damage from other group attacks wielded by countless monsters throughout this place. By the time I even reached Phantom, the party was already hurting. Add to it that Phantom clobbered Gurv and Azure, and I knew this run wasn't getting very far. Nevertheless, I pressed onward, testing the waters with some status spells and other such bits of information that might help later on, until Azure fell just shy of reaching Lich, after which I promptly fled. Next attempt, Phantom went down quick, but I was still suffering from all of the breath attacks. Especially Gotti, who didn't even make it as far as Azure did last time, forcing another early retreat. 3 more attempts finally got me through the gas dragon room in good health. Until some frost dragons left me hardly any better off, nor did a critical hit on Gurv. Still, after swapping Gotti's weapon upon realizing he'd been using the incorrect one based on his accuracy, I tested myself against Lich. It went well! Azure was brought to kneel in the fire area, but I wanted to grab all the chests before retreating. I hid him behind the mages and started blasting my way through with my strongest spells. That mission was a narrow success. After 2 more failures, I had my very first exceptional run. I was developing a feel for when to use which status spells, and I got through some gas dragons without a single poison breath. Gurv took a crit from a mud golem, but thanks to some lucky dodges, I reached Lich with everyone above 300 HP, only to then get immediately nuked. At this point, I really wasn't enjoying this challenge anymore. It was already more tedious than engaging, with most of its actual challenges boiling down to just throwing myself at a dungeon enough times to get lucky. But honestly, I expected that going into it. Nonetheless, I also expected to at least be somewhat consistently inching myself further along with each failure. But this was just one completely sporadic loss or retreat after another with no semblance of progress, even as my levels were increasing. Largely because level ups don't increase your absorb at all, and a few extra hit points seldom added even one extra hit to my longevity. After 4 more failures, I eventually reached Kari. Everyone but Gurv was in rough shape, but I had to give it a try. I wasn't going to get anywhere without taking some risks. Sadly, while I did defeat her, Gati didn't make it. But with a bit of backtracking while fleeing from whatever battles I could, Gati was able to warp us back to the present. Thanks entirely to luck against Lich, I defeated Kari in good shape on my next attempt. I could finally start exploring the water area, which meant lots of zapping things. Summarizing this whole area, Gurv used the Thor hammer and Gati used the Zeus gauntlet, while Azure and Gati cast lightning too, only changing up when battling water elementals, which called for Ice 3. Without any chests to grab, I was soon standing before Kraken. Gati was hurting, but everyone else was looking decent. Buffing up Gurv, Kraken went down with ease. I was zooming along now. All it took was dumb luck to not get destroyed by enemy spells. Besides fleeing from some sorcerers because fuck them, the wind area had the easiest battles yet. The corridor to the Masamune was guarded by nothing but a bunch of golems that crumbled to our blades. I gave the Masamune to Azure. Gurv didn't need it. He was already executing everything that wasn't a boss in one hit. I considered giving it to Gati, but I needed him prioritizing magic. Every turn spent casting spells would have been a turn that Masamune spent going to waste. Although once or twice I did swap it over to Gurv against bosses. The next stretch further evidenced the biggest problem with this challenge. Despite wielding the ultimate weapon with levels that were continuously growing, I didn't feel any closer to completing this dungeon than when I first arrived. Being stronger helped a little bit, but that bonus was negligible compared to the necessity that I didn't get pummeled by magic before I could fight back due to disadvantageous turn orders. It made no difference how much stronger I'd become if I couldn't dispatch the enemies any quicker before they could fire off those devastating attacks. When I did manage to make it back to the water area, I had Gati use Lightning 3 instead of 2 to get through the battles faster, but kept Gati using the Zeus Gauntlet. I didn't want him wasting his Fog 2 and Exit points by casting Lightning 3 unless it was an absolute emergency. I also cast Fast and Temper on Azure instead of Gurv against Kari and Kraken, in combination with Azure using the Power Gauntlet on himself, while Gati protected the party with Fog 2. The protection wasn't enough, and Gurv fell. But I'd come too far to turn back now. Gati moved to the front since his HP was holding up surprisingly well, and I needed to keep Azure safe before chaos. Round 2! My luck held up until the water area, where Gotti and Azure swapped places to preserve the ninja's relatively diminishing hit points. I carried that tactic into the Kraken fight, which disastrously backfired. But now that I've reached Chaos once, I felt like I should be able to win at my current levels, so I kept going instead of retreating to try again from scratch. This time Gotti went all in on offense, blasting Chaos with Ice and Lightning 3. Gotti cast Fast, then Temper on Gurv, then let fly with the nukes. As the battle raged on, Gurv and Gotti had one foot in the grave, and Gotti fell to a mighty punch. Backed into a corner with nothing left to lose, Gurv firmly grasped the legendary sword's hilt, steeled his resolve, and lunged for Chaos, delivering a killing blow to cleave the darkness when all hope seemed lost, thereby severing the time loop and bringing peace back to the world. And there you have it, Final Fantasy without healing outside of resting. As for my final thoughts, all I can say is that this run wasn't as fun as I think it could have been. Prior to the final dungeon, which was a tedious mess of just needing to get lucky enough, the biggest issue was that in order to conserve my hit points, I had to heavily rely on magic, especially status effects early on. Sleep, slow, dark, hold, whatever I could do to mitigate damage in compensation for my lack of healing, while also saving my bigger spells for when I needed them the most. Now, for some people that would provide a unique experience, but I already use those kinds of spells plenty when playing normally. In fact, very few of my solutions to any combat scenario were really changed here, outside of being less conservative with magic points in dungeons. Sure, it was taking a few more trips than usual to get through them, but again, that's also something I normally do in lieu of actively grinding. And whenever it was particularly hard, all that really did was make the game more tedious instead of interesting. There just weren't enough variables to tilt the scales in my favor, outside of simply getting higher numbers or being lucky with enemy encounters, turn orders, and whether or not the game just decided that it was time to get a game over. That said, until the final dungeon, I would say that I was having enough fun to not complain, although I would never do something exactly like this again. At least not in Final Fantasy. Still, it was fulfilling in that as a kid, I always used to wonder how feasible certain RPGs would be without healing, since so many of them make healing magic and items seem like the one real advantage the player holds over the enemy. Anyway, it's about time to wrap this thing up. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to do all the YouTube things, and I'll see you next time.